Welcome to my managerial economics class, and we are looking at monopoly. So the idea behind the monopoly is that this is a market which is served by one firm. So one firm faces the whole entire market, and the product they produce has no close substitute in the market. Then in that instance, that firm is a monopoly. So now, what is the idea behind a monopoly? The idea is that the monopoly need not necessarily be a large firm, but the key thing is that are there any firms that are selling output which is a close substitute? If there are none, then the firm is a monopoly. And the idea is that the firm, the output they produce, that will be actually representing the market demand for the firm. What do I mean? The firm are producing output, and they are the only ones who are producing that output. So market demand is downward sloping. So it means that if they determine quantity, as they are increasing quantity, price will be falling. That's the idea. Price of the output will be falling. And the idea is that a monopoly, if the monopolist controls quantity, then price is the outcome of what the public is willing to pay for this quantity. But if the monopoly is able to set price, then the quantity is the outcome of what the public is willing to buy at those prices that are set. Now, what is the issue about a monopoly? The idea is that a monopoly possesses market power. Even if they are a quantity monopolist, they can choose quantity that gets them the right price, generating the desired profit they are looking for. Or the monopolist can choose a price that generates them the quantity which gets them the desired level of profit. So because of that, they are able to influence the market. They possess some market power to influence price and quantity. Now, the thing is this, some monopolies necessarily are constrained by legal restriction. For instance, if you look at the energy sector in Zambia, specifically electricity, the actions that, for instance, ZESCO have to take have to be approved by a higher authority. So from that perspective, when it comes to price, they cannot easily set the price they want. The price has to be allowed or declined by another authority. So there's some kind of like legal restriction. So in the absence of legal restriction, the idea is that a monopolist is free to set any price quantity combination that yields them the profit that they want. That's the idea. So now, what are the sources of monopoly? What are the sources of monopoly? How can a monopoly arise? So a monopoly can arise because of economies of scope. Economies of scope. Economies of scope. So what do we mean? So the idea is that if you've got, for instance, two firms, production firm and marketing firm, they are both they belong to the same parent company. The idea is that the production firm can be producing some output which is a raw material for the marketing firm. Now the thing is this, because the production firm produces an output which is converted to something else, there is a scope for the firm at marketing level to produce some output. For instance, I am mining some iron, and when I mine iron, there is a scope for me to start the steel industry. So you could have one firm which is mining the iron, and the other firm which is making steel of all manner of shapes. So now, because I'm mining iron, there is a scope for me to make steel. So because there is a scope for me to make steel in the context of subsidiary company, so one firm is the mining, the other one is the market, it's the steel industry. There's a scope for this company to make steel. And because the mining itself is controlled by the same parent company, it's as if you are getting hold of the supply chain where you produce and sell to your subsidiaries. So what that means is that you have scope for making steel in that instance. And because you have got scope for making steel, it is very possible that you can be selling the iron to the steel industry at cost of production, not at market price. So what it means is that at the steel level, if there are other competitors who are just in steel production but they don't have mine production for iron, then they cannot necessarily have the same advantage as you. They will be buying the iron at market price, which could be different from cost, but you'll be buying the iron from your subsidiary at cost of production. So what it means is that you may end up having advantages of lower production costs. So the idea is that because there's scope for you to make steel from your iron production, that necessarily implies that you own an advantage in terms of cost, because you literally control the supply chain compared to firms which do not. So economies of scope can generate a monopoly. So now, there is also cost complementarity. So sometimes you may be operating in an industry where as the level of production is expanding, in the same example that I'm giving, as you are increasing production at production level, you are expanding output. What happens to costs? Sometimes average costs tend to reduce. So because average costs tend to reduce as you're expanding production at cost level, then at subsidiary level, they will enjoy the benefit of buying your output at reduced cost. So you're producing iron. Now, if your costs of production are going down, then your subsidiary company can afford to buy that iron at lower costs, and then they transform it into steel. Meaning, the other firms who don't have that relationship that you have may not enjoy that advantage. So what it means is that there are some cost complementarities. So that's the idea. You end up having some cost complementarities. The other issue that can bring about a monopoly is patents and other legal barriers. So the idea is that with patents, you are a firm and you spend some time into developing a new product, research and development. You spend money to come up with a new product. And once you come up with that new product, you patent it. So once that product is patented, what it means is that you can sell that output on the market for some given years, perhaps 17 to 20 years, and there will be no one who will be able to make that similar product lest they infringe on your rights over that property. So you get some form of rights. So you discover a new drug, to some disease that's incurable, for instance, what gets to happen? You patent it. As long as the knowledge you are using is not existing knowledge, no one knows it, then a patent will be granted to you. So during the period that the patent is active, no one can use that knowledge, that technology to make a drug to compete with you. So because of that, you become a monopoly. And once you become a monopoly, you possess some market power. But there can also be some legal barriers that arise. For instance, in a number of countries, the telecoms industry, you find that maybe only one state, one company which is owned by the state is allowed to operate telecoms. So there may be many players who want to enter the market. They apply to enter the market, but perhaps there's a legal barrier which says that is a reserve of a state-owned company. So it means that no other company will be allowed. Why? Because that market has a legal barrier which does not allow many players to enter the market. So patents and legal barriers can generate a monopoly. Sometimes a monopoly can arise because the market is too small to have many players. Maybe the market is better served by only having one player. What do we mean? Suppose this is your average cost. Suppose this is the average cost. Now, if this is the average cost, let's assume that the market is prepared to buy this much market output. So let's say market output, QM. Now, if this is the output, the idea is that the market is willing to pay a price of PM. If you produce QM, the market is willing to pay a price of PM along the demand curve. Now, if you allow two firms to enter the market and we assume that each of them produces, let's say, half. Let's assume that here you have half QM. So if each of them produce half, when you add, you arrive at QM. So what gets to happen? If each of them only produces half, then the average cost of production will be somewhere there. Average cost of production. But when you add up the total output, the market is only willing to pay a price of PM. So what do you notice? Average cost will be higher than the price the market is willing to pay. So in this market, it doesn't make sense to have two firms competing. You'd rather have one firm produce the output. So as they expand output, what happens to average cost? Average cost 4. So in this instance, average cost for one firm will be here. So it means that in some markets, economies of scale do not allow competitors. You'd rather have one firm which enjoys economies of scale to produce output and it becomes a monopoly than have two firms which are competing to produce output. What will happen? They'll have some kind of diseconomies. As they are producing output, the average cost will be much higher than the price the public is willing to pay. So it means that in that instance, a monopoly can arise. So you find that in some countries with smaller population, they can only have maybe one telecom company. No need for having two companies. Why? Because the market is too small. The market, imagine you have a population of 3 million and you're trying to bring in telecoms company to compete for 3 million people. That's the total population now. But that kind of like does not make sense because within 3 million people, not everyone can have phones. So from that perspective, it makes sense to only have one firm save the whole entire market in that instance. The market is not large enough for a lot of firms. Now, when we discussed elasticity, one of the things we mentioned was the relationship between marginal revenue and marginal revenue and elasticity. Marginal revenue and elasticity. What we discussed was that if this is your demand curve, the marginal revenue function will depict it by this marginal revenue. Then this is demand, this is quantity, that's price. And then here we have total revenue. Total revenue, and the total revenue, we depicted it like this. And what did we mention in that elasticity topic? So the idea is that where this marginal revenue is 0, somewhere there, elasticity. Where this marginal revenue is 0, somewhere there, you have unitary elastic demand. Then from here to just before there, it's elastic demand. And then from here to there, demand is inelastic. So what we saw in that lecture was that the marginal revenue, you've noticed this blue diagram, here it's 0, so between 0 and there, marginal revenue is positive. So where marginal revenue is positive, as you're expanding output, marginal revenue is positive. So what happens to total revenue? Is rising. Now this total revenue, when is it at a maximum? It's at a maximum when marginal revenue is equal to 0, somewhere there. And what gets to happen with total revenue? Total revenue tends to fall when marginal revenue is negative. So if you're expanding output and you're operating in an elastic region, marginal revenue will be negative and total revenue will be falling. That's what it is. And last time we derived the relationship between marginal revenue, we said, and elasticity. We said marginal revenue is equal to price plus 1. What was that relationship we defined? We said it's equal to price plus price. We had 1 over 1 plus price, brackets, 1 plus elasticity, everything over elasticity. We derived that equation, which was amounting to this. Of course, it didn't exactly look like this, but it could still be transformed to look like this. So we had a relationship where we showed that in fact the elasticity matters. We derived it in the other lecture. Yeah, we derived it in the other lecture. So there's that relationship where which we saw